Welcome, wherever you are, to Chapter 10, The World Divided. Globalization, Weinstein says, has not been a steady, unimpeded process. Today's world is as much characterized by division and difference as it is by unity. As we continue to modernize, barring some nuclear holocaust sending us back to the Stone Age, there will continue to be resistance to that modernization, and some will benefit more than others. In line with that, I'd like to tell you a story. Consider the life circumstances of two different peanut farmers, one in the American state of Georgia and the other in the West African nation of Senegal. Both areas are internationally important regions for the commercial production of peanuts. The Georgia grower cultivates about 540 acres of peanuts and another 650 acres of corn. Its fields are prepared by a large tractor, and he uses improved varieties of seeds and fertilizers that have been developed by government-sponsored research. Pesticides are sprayed on his crops from an airplane, and the crops are harvested by a mechanical combine, which separates the peanuts for driving. They're stored in a modern warehouse. He sells his crops to a regional broker who resells it to a larger broker in Atlanta, perhaps New York or Chicago. The prices the farmer gets are maintained well above the world market price by government price support programs. The government also restricts imports and limits domestic acreage, all of which protect him from rapid price fluctuation. Research, mechanization, government support, and hard work enable him to net, after costs, as much as $100,000 in good years, and his family lives in comfort, enjoying the wide variety of basic and luxury goods and services available to affluent Americans. The Senegalese grower cultivates a small farm near the village where he and his family live. Like the American farmer, he inherited his farm, which is the sole source of support for his family of 5 and 3 other relatives. Until recently, his crop was hand-planted and picked, but he's recently begun to mechanize. Fertilizers and pesticides are either too expensive or unavailable. His per-acre yield is about 1/5 of that of the American grower. Storage facilities are rudimentary, and there are losses because of insects and blight. The Senegalese grower sells his crop to a government corporation at well below the world market price. The corporation in turn resells it on the world market at a higher price. The difference between what the farmer is paid and the government export price is a major source of government revenue. Small farm size, poor yields, storage losses, and low prices keep the typical Senegalese farmer very poor. His net income is about $400 per year. By contrast, the field workers on a Georgia farm, who are poor by American standards, earn $100 per week when they work. In addition to the peanut crop, which he sells, the African farmer also grows food for his family, mainly millet, which is made into gruel. His village has no electricity and is likely to have no school or health clinic. His wife draws water from a well near the village. 1/5 of the children born in the village do not survive to adulthood. While most of the Senegalese are poor small farmers, the minority who live in the capital city of Dakar live much better. Government officials are likely to have nice homes, drive cars, and work in air-conditioned offices. In both America and Senegal, the political process affects and distorts the economic process. The Georgia farmer is represented in Washington by a member of Congress who is responsive to his need to maintain price supports. The poor Senegalese farmer has little or no political influence, on the other hand. His government is controlled by the minority of urban dwellers who live in Dakar, and is responsive primarily to their interests and needs, not his. The lives of the American and Senegalese farmers sharply define two worlds, one more developed and the other less developed. They are vastly different in geography, standards of living, and economic, social, and political structure. For our purposes here, the less developed world includes most of the nations of South Asia, Latin and Central America, Africa, and the Middle East. Putting it another way, the developed world comprises the nations of the Northern Hemisphere, while the less developed nations are concentrated in the Southern Hemisphere. Lumping all these countries into a single category called the Third World, or Less Developed Countries, LDCs, of course obscures their diversity. They are economically similar because compared to the developed nations, their economies are less productive, more likely to be dependent upon a single or a few commodity exports, and have relatively large subsistence economic sectors. In spite of differences within the Third World, it is important for you to recognize that on a global basis, many more people live like the Senegalese farmer than the American one. And even the Senegalese farmer is relatively well off by world standards, since about a fourth of persons who live in less developed countries are residents of urban slums, having neither land or other means of support, living lives of material destitution and despair. For them, development is a mirage. What we're witnessing in the world today, 2012, is that even the poorest, less developed countries, the people there, are aware that abject misery is no longer the lot of all people. They do not want to surrender their cultural uniqueness to the forces of change, but they universally want development in terms of better material security, literacy, health, and life expectancy. They want freedom, self-determination, and a better life. And they have come to believe that it is possible. Now let's move on to social stratification. Some of the world's nations are wealthy, others are poor, and some, of course, are in between. This layering of nations and of groups of people within a nation is called social stratification. Social stratification even affects the way we think about life. If you'd been born in the Ethiopian family in the opening vignette, for example, you would be illiterate and would expect your children to be the same. You would also expect hunger to be a part of life and would not be too surprised when people die young. To be born in the US family, in contrast, would give you quite a different world view. Social stratification is a system in which groups of people are divided into layers, according to their relative power, property, and prestige. It is a way of ranking large groups of people into a hierarchy according to their relative privileges. It's also important to note that every society stratifies its members. Some societies have greater inequality than others, but some social stratification is universal. In addition, in every society of the world, gender is a basis for stratifying people. On the basis of their gender, people are either allowed or denied access to the good things offered by the society they live in. So let's consider the three major systems of social stratification: slavery, caste, and class. Slavery, whose essential characteristic is ownership of some people by others, has been common in world history. The Old Testament even lays out rules for how the Israelites should treat their slaves. The Romans also had slaves, as did the Africans and the Greeks. Slavery was least common among nomads, especially hunters and gatherers, and most common in agricultural societies. Contrary to popular assumptions, slavery was not usually based on race, but on one of three other factors. The first was debt. In some cultures, an individual who could not pay a debt could be enslaved by the creditor. A second cause of slavery was crime. Instead of being killed, a murderer or thief might be enslaved by the family of the victim as compensation for their loss. The third was war and conquest. Slavery, then, was a sign of debt, of crime, of defeat in battle. Slavery was not a sign that the slave was inherently inferior. The conditions of slavery have varied widely around the world. In some cases, slavery was only temporary. Slaves of the Israelites were set free in the year of the Jubilee, which occurred every 50 years. Roman slaves ordinarily had the right to buy themselves out of slavery. In some instances, however, slavery was a lifelong condition. Some criminals, for example, became slaves when they were given life sentences as oarsmen on Roman warships. There they served until death, which often came quickly to those in this exhausting service. Slavery was not necessarily inheritable. In most places, the children of slaves were automatically slaves themselves. But in some instances, the child of a slave who served a rich family might even be adopted by that family. Slaves were not necessarily powerless and poor. In almost all instances, slaves owned no property and had no power. Again, among some groups, however, slaves could accumulate property and even rise to a high position. With a growing need for labor, some colonists in the New World tried to enslave Indians. This attempt, however, failed miserably. One reason was that when Indians escaped, they knew how to survive in the wilderness and were able to make their way back to their tribe. The colonists then turned to Africans who were being brought to North America and South America by the Dutch, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Because slavery has a broad range of causes, some analysts conclude that racism didn't lead to slavery, but rather, slavery led to racism. Finding it profitable to make people slaves for life, U.S. slave owners developed an ideology, beliefs that justify social arrangements. They developed the view that the slaves were inferior. Some even said that they were not fully human. In short, the colonists developed elaborate justifications for slavery, built on the presumed superiority of their group. And to make slavery even more profitable, slave states passed laws that made slavery inheritable. That is, the babies born to slaves became the property of the slave owner. Slavery today rears its ugly head all over the world. In the Sudan, Mauritania, and Benin, this region, for example, has a long history of slavery, and it was not until 1980 that slavery was officially abolished in Mauritania, and not until 1987 in Sudan. Although officially abolished, slavery continues. Enslavement of members of the Dinka tribe in Sudan is the topic of the mass media box that we will be discussing later. Children of the Dinka tribe in rural Sudan, for example, don't go to school. They work. Their families depend on them to tend the cattle that are so important to their way of life. In 1998, for example, a village was attacked by Arabs from northern Sudan. The children who were captured were forced to march hundreds of miles north. Some escaped on the way, others did not. Tens of thousands of Dinkas have been killed or enslaved since civil war broke out in Sudan in the 1980s. Yet the Arab-led government, the National Islamic Front, insists that slavery does not exist. It claims to be an invention of foreign politicians. The United States bombed Kosovo into submission for its crimes against humanity, yet it has remained silent in the face of this outrage. A cynic might say that Kosovo was located at a politically strategic spot in Europe, whereas Sudan occupies an area of Africa in which the US and European powers have little interest. There is, I think, some truth to this. To wax philosophical, power is only used when it is in the interests or benefits of the one wielding the power. Let's move on to the caste system. This is the second system of social stratification. In a caste system, status is determined by birth and is lifelong. Someone born into a low status group will always have low status, no matter how much that person may accomplish in life. India is a classic example. India's caste system is not based on race, but on religion. It's existed for almost 3,000 years. Although the Indian government formally abolished the caste system in 1949, these century-old practices cannot be so easily eliminated, and the caste system remains part of everyday life in India. The ceremonies people follow at birth, marriages, and deaths, for example, are dictated by caste. The upper castes resist the upward mobility of the untouchables, the people at the bottom, sometimes even through violence. And now we come to class. In stratification systems like slavery and caste, the lines drawn between people are firm, and there is little or no movement from one group to another. A class system, in contrast, is much more open, for it is based primarily on money or material possessions. It too begins at birth, when individuals are ascribed the status of their parents. But, unlike these other systems, people can change their social class by what they achieve or fail to achieve in life. In addition, there are no laws which specify people's occupations on the basis of birth, or prohibit marriage between the classes. So, where does this leave us? Weinstein says his chapter on the world divided examines sources of contemporary social conflict. The first, he says, is because of diversity. We've covered that. The different types of societies, why they think the way they do. What we haven't covered, and he spends quite a bit of time discussing in terms of norms and values, is how one group believes or takes on the position that they have been wronged, and then comes to the conclusion that revenge is the only outcome to redress that wrong. And that explains 9/11, because the Muslim group that did it believed that they suffered from the evil deeds of the United States and the West. Weinstein points out that for most of human history, say up through the 1500s, the world was not culturally diverse. What happened in the 1500s onward with the colonial rule and expansion of the European empires is that through their power and through their expansion, we have an incredibly high ethnic diversity beginning and being imposed, so to speak, on other cultures. European expansion did not replace slavery or conquest, but it added the new dimension of migration. On page 249, Weinstein says one of the major factors that brought about the cultural diversity that now characterizes the United States and other countries is the international division of labor, established by the European colonial powers. The earliest migrations of Europeans into the New World introduced the first form of diversity, as the native people came to occupy the lowest strata of the colonial order. Prior to that time, the indigenous populations were relatively small, isolated, and culturally distinct. In every instance, colonial rule created a complex ethnic structure that generally consisted of one or more dominant European cultures, often of a numerical minority, as in South Africa, 2, various lower strata of indigenous populations, and 3, imported former slave, indentured, or other laborers. Going back to what we discussed earlier in this segment, the world is divided into the more developed world, the developing world, and the less developed world, depending on which scale you used. So, how do we explain it? One way is through modernization theory, which views the world society as a relatively stable system of interrelated parts. Modernization theory views social change as an evolutionary type process that gradually adapted to a changing environment. It's important to note that modernization theory is based upon the European developmental experience. It suggests that all countries can become modern industrial societies. The primary characteristic of modernization is differentiation. A few institutions that provided broad-ranging services to the citizenry characterized pre-modern societies. Modern societies, on the other hand, consist of a variety of specialized institutions. And finally, modernization theory views development as an internal process in each society, of course generally perceived as a nation-state. And nation-states often view each other as independent of the others. Finally, there are prerequisites for modernization. Institutional, for example, we must have democracy, anti-communism, and a laissez-faire government policy regarding the economy. And secondly, people in developing countries have to develop traits like individualism, personal achievement, and a desire to control their own destiny. Individuals must learn to want economic growth and must be willing to become more mobile. They must learn to defer gratification. and the legitimacy of the state becomes important. Marxists argue that the first world involvement in the internal development of poor countries is not desirable. International relationships overall flow from a basic desire by first world capitalists to acquire profit. Let's face it, we do not invade a strong country. We invade poor countries. The quest for profits can involve the search for raw materials, for example, oil, inexpensive agricultural products, bananas, for example, in Central America, land or people, that is, inexpensive labor or slaves. The profit from the sale of agricultural products can be enhanced by the first world country acquiring land in a semi-tropical area, such as Central or Latin America, where the crop can be grown in abundance. For example, this is why we import coffee, cotton, and sugar. These are all done by American companies who own the land in these less developed countries. Natural resources such as petroleum, copper, and iron are needed in industrial societies. Poor countries are sources of those raw materials. Colonialism, the search for agricultural and natural resources, can lead to colonialism. It is a political economic arrangement under which powerful countries establish, for their own profit, rule over weaker countries. And finally, a relatively new strategy is to move factories from high-wage countries to low-wage countries. A company may choose the strategy when rising wage rates in industrial countries begin to threaten corporate profits. We live, after all, in a capitalist system. Dependency theories argue that the poverty experienced by low-income countries is the immediate consequence of their exploitation by wealthy countries on which they are economically dependent. They are essentially locked into a downward spiral of exploitation and poverty. Some theorists call this the development of underdevelopment. Foreign businesses make important economic and political decisions for their own advantage and without regard for the best interests of the local population. Except for a few local businessmen who serve the interests of foreign capital, the local population becomes impoverished. Another explanation of global stratification is world system theory. The world system represents a system of internal stratification. We must understand the world capitalist system as a single unit, not as individual countries. Unlike dependency theory, world system theory argues that there is room for poorer countries to advance within the context of the world economy, although this happens rarely. There are three zones in the world system: the core, that is the most advanced industrial countries who control most of the wealth and the world economy. Secondly, you have the periphery, which consists of low-income, largely agricultural countries. Core countries, that is the West, manipulate them for the economic advantage of the West. And finally, you have the semi-periphery, which refers to countries that occupy an intermediate position in the world economy. They extract profit from the periphery and are simultaneously exploited by the core. So where does this lead us? Well, by the 1980s, sociologists have documented 8 marital and family changes occurring on a global basis that are associated with development. Marital selection is taken from the hands of elders. Ethnic endogamy declines, but not class. There's an increase in the proportion of the population that is unmarried. Age-discrepant marriages increase. Dowry or bride price customs weaken. Concubinage and polygamy decline. Infanticide decreases, and family size ultimately decreases. There are also general social consequences of globalization. A growing global labor surplus generates global migrants. There is an intensification of informal economic activity and a growing crisis of declining government legitimacy at national levels. And this applies for all, whether it be the core or the periphery. And last but not least, the consequences of globalization have elicited social responses among diverse nations around the world. We have democracy spreading around the world by the 1990s. We have fundamentalism, which expresses a desire to return to a more simple life and traditional culture. We have environmentalism, the growth of feminism, and finally, cosmopolitan localism. In terms of the latter, cosmopolitan localism means that as globalism intensifies, multiculturalism and local differences proliferate and intensify. Well, that's it. That's Chapter 10. And I hope to see you with Chapter 11. Good day.